Hey, friends. It seemed like a good time to do a more theory-ish one of these. So I wanted to talk about this book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Robert Nozick from 1974. It was published 51 years ago, and it is still one of the books about political philosophy most commonly assigned to undergrads. Honestly, there are probably not a lot of well-stocked Barnes and Nobles anywhere in the English-speaking world that don't have a copy. And I don't want to be a hack and just dismiss it completely and tell you it's garbage because I don't like the main conclusion. I actually wrote something about this for Jacobin at the end of last year. How Capitalism Undermines Freedom was the name of the article. And one of the first things I say there is that this book's level of success is in some ways actually well-deserved. Nozick really is a very good writer. He has some real stylistic flair. At the same time, that as thoroughly as I disagree with all of his most important conclusions, at least some of the arguments really are pretty rigorous. I think during the parts of the book where he's doing stuff like arguing against utilitarianism, there are even real insights there. But Nozick was, when he wrote this, a hardcore libertarian. He thought that any distribution of wealth, right, any redistribution of wealth, right, taken away from plutocrats to give to others, was unacceptable, right? He thought that any distribution of wealth you ended up with was fine as long as it came from letting the chips fall where they may in a free market. The only justifiable state would be a night watchman state, which would be limited to protecting persons against murder, assault, theft, fraud, and so forth. On this view, even if inequality becomes so severe that poor people are starving to death in the streets, okay, it might be admirable for rich people to voluntarily help them, but taxing the rich to fund a welfare state would be an unacceptable violation of property rights. And nationalizing the businesses currently owned by the rich and turning them over to the democratic management of workers and larger communities, which is, obviously what socialists like me want, would be way, way out of the question. However nice a more equal society might sound, Nozick thought that there was no way to achieve a society like that and preserve it over time without huge and unacceptable violations of liberty. Now, to be totally fair, Nozick himself had backed away from this extreme libertarian position by, good morning, Dre, by the end of the 1980s. Although his second thoughts have never received nearly as much attention as this book did. And what's even worse is that no one casually browsing the shelves at Barnes & Noble is likely to run into the work of the philosopher who did a better job than anyone else did of taking apart Nozick's arguments piece by piece in the 1970s. That would be the patron saint of this show, the Canadian analytical Marxist philosopher G.A. Cohen. So one of the most memorable arguments in Anarchy, State, and Utopia is about the basketball player Wilt Chamberlain, who was widely beloved at the time, and not just by the opposite sex. I think he famously claimed to have slept with, what was it, like 800 women or something? I don't remember exactly, but some pretty staggering number. And, even outside of that, people really enjoyed watching him play. And so Nozick uses this Wilt Chamberlain thought experiment to try to show that a just distribution of goods is one that comes about in the right way, rather than one that conforms to a certain pattern. So here's what I mean by that. Like, egalitarianism is one idea you might have about the correct pattern of distribution. Egalitarians think that, at least in some important respect, distribution should be at least roughly equal. Or sufficientarianism is another idea about what the right pattern of distribution looks like. Sufficientarians disagree with egalitarians because sufficientarians think it doesn't matter how big the gap is between the top and the bottom end of a distribution, but they do think it's important that the bottom should be set high enough that the people at the bottom can have a reasonable and dignified life. So, like, Steven Pinker is a big sufficientarian. Harry Frankfurt, who I wrote something about several months ago, was like maybe the sort of highest profile philosopher who advocated sufficientarianism. Even Jordan Peterson sometimes gestures in that direction, that like, okay, maybe there's a concern with economic inequality if the bottom end of it is too miserable. Even though he certainly thinks that just, being concerned about inequality per se is wrong. So these obviously aren't people who I like or agree with. My position is that inequality matters. I care where the floor is set, of course. That's, a matter of moral importance. But I disagree with the sufficientarians because I think it also matters how much distance there is between the floor and the ceiling. But even these guys are being targeted by Nozick's Wilt Chamberlain argument, because even the sufficientarians have a certain view about which patterns of wealth and resource distribution are or are not just. And Nozick is trying to show that any distribution whatsoever could be just if it comes about in what he thinks is the right way. So let's get into it. TC, European-friendly times are standard now. We're trying something new. Drea says, if my economic plan takes your life, that's fine. But if it takes my yacht and summer home, well, that's a bridge too far. Yeah, I mean, right. That is the in practice upshot of this, right? That's I think of this kind of extreme libertarianism. But here's Nozick's argument. Here's the idea. He asks us to consider a thought experiment where we're starting with a given distribution of wealth, call it D1. And Nozick says we can imagine that distribution D1 is whatever you think the best pattern of wealth distribution would look like. Whatever that is. If you're a strict egalitarian, imagine that everybody has an equal share. Or maybe you agree with John Rawls, right? His view was that inequalities can sometimes be justified if, among other conditions, they benefit the worst off by creating incentives for people to make contributions that lift up the floor for everybody. But Rawls also thought that any inequalities that didn't pass his test of justice were unacceptable. So if you're a Rawlsian, imagine that D1 is a distribution that passes the Rawlsian test. If you're a sufficientarian, imagine that it's one where everybody has at least enough, whatever the inequalities are. If you're an egalitarian, imagine that it's equal outcomes, whatever. The point is D1 is whatever you think a just end state distribution looks like. Next, imagine that Wilt Chamberlain refuses to play basketball unless everyone who attends one of his games drops 25 cents in a special box with his name on it. Chamberlain is so popular and beloved that 1 million people attend his games, each cheerfully dropping a quarter in the box. He now has $250,000 more than whatever he had in distribution D1. And when I wrote my Jacobin article about this, I fed that number into an online inflation calculator, and $250,000 in 1974 was like $1.5 million last year when I wrote the article, and so it's probably slightly more than that now. The point is, this basketball player is now a millionaire in this scenario. So we've moved from D1 to an at least somewhat less egalitarian D2. It's just like D1, except Wilt Chamberlain has all this money. But Nozick asks, how can a proponent of a pattern-based view of distributive justice coherently object to this outcome? So Nozick writes, quote, there is no question about whether each of the people was entitled to the control over the resources they held in D1, because that was the distribution that, for the purposes of argument, we assumed was acceptable. Each of these persons chose to give 25 cents their money to Chamberlain. They could have spent it on going to the movies or on candy bars or on copies of Dissent magazine or Monthly Review. And I guess for context, for anybody who doesn't know, their 1970s leftist references, Dissent and Monthly Review were probably the highest profile socialist magazines at the time that Nozick was writing this. Presumably, if he had been writing in 2024 instead of 1974, that little jab would have been at the expense of, Jacobin. In any case, Nozick says, look, everyone in D1 had as much wealth as the theorists that he's arguing against think that they should have had, right? Whatever the advocate of the pattern-based distribution, whether it's, Rawls or egalitarians or sufficientarians or whatever, right? They had as much wealth as you think they should have. This wealth was then theirs to do with what they wanted. And they didn't want to spend it on movie tickets or copies of socialist magazines. They wanted to spend it on putting it in the box to watch Wilt Chamberlain play basketball. So the idea that the transition from D1 to D2 involves the introduction of some sort of injustice is just absurd, according to Nozick. After all, he points out, who has legitimate grounds for complaint in this scenario? The people who voluntarily gave their quarters to Chamberlain? It doesn't seem like it. They did that of their own free will. The people who decided of their own free will not to see Chamberlain and thus did not part with the quarter? Nope. They still have their full initial D1 shares. So what do they have to complain about? And certainly Chamberlain himself doesn't have anything to complain about. But now you might have at least one wealthy man, which, okay, might not be the biggest deal if you have equality except for Chamberlain, but presumably this isn't a one-off event. Starting from D1, you could have had all sorts of similarly morally innocent mechanisms that could give rise to new people building out fortunes. In each case, since we started from justice, right? We're just assuming that whatever D1 was just, and we're proceeding from there by means of just steps, either people spending money you think they should have had to do with what they want, or not spending it, then no one has a right to complain. So now, as a result of all this, you've got widespread economic inequality. And once those fortunes have been built up in these unobjectionable ways, will you stop Chamberlain and his fellow newly rich people from voluntarily passing on their fortunes to their heirs? Because, if so, you're again stopping a voluntary transfer of funds that originated in what you thought everybody should have. But now, if you do allow that, before you know it, you don't just have economic inequality, you have intergenerational class divisions. And we could keep spinning out Nozick's point. Will you stop Chamberlain from using some of this money to buy a factory and hire willing workers? If not, then even if D1 was a socialist society where the means of production were collectively owned and democratically run by the public at large, capitalism will be reintroduced at D2. So the lesson that Nozick draws from all this is that the only way to maintain a pattern of distribution over time, right? That, I think certain patterns of distribution are just and other ones are unjust, and I want to make sure we maintain the just one. The only way to do that would be to forbid certain kinds of what he calls capitalistic acts between consenting adults. Right? Man had a way with words. So the title of this section of the book is called How Liberty Upsets Patterns. Right? So you can have liberty or you can have a certain pattern of distribution, but you can't have both. That's the idea. Hadrian of Theseus says, when I was 18, I came up with a dismissive rebuttal I called my Don King argument. Nice. Drea says, to be fair, Chamberlain would have had a lot of child support to pay. So yeah, maybe it's okay if he is the one wealthy guy. All right. So this is probably a good time for a side note about what bugs me so much about how a lot of people are introduced to these debates. Because the range of views about economic justice that undergraduates are likely to be presented with in most introductory surveys of political philosophy ranges from Nozick-style hardcore libertarianism on the right end of the spectrum to the philosophy of John Rawls at the left end. And Rawls is usually understood as a defender of modified welfare state capitalism. I mean, to be fair, at the end of his life, in his book, Justice is Fairness is a Restatement, Rawls explicitly rejects that reading of his theory and said, no, capitalism can't pass muster on the standards of justice, not even modified welfare state capitalism. But most people don't know that he said that. And that's certainly not how Rawls is going to be presented in the intro-level political philosophy course. And all of that means that the map of the philosophical terrain, which students are typically introduced to, just totally leaves out socialist and Marxist alternatives. That's like off the map somewhere, the area marked "Here They Be Dragons." Similarly, someone browsing the philosophy shelves at Barnes & Noble will be likely to run into both The Theory of Justice by Rawls, Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Nozick, but they aren't likely to find any books written by G.A. Cohen. And that's a shame for many reasons, not least that one of the best responses to the Wilt Chamberlain argument was written by Cohen. So Cohen's intervention, let me just do a quick screen share on this. So this is the paper. It's from 1977. It's called Robert Nozick and Wilt Chamberlain: How Patterns Preserve Liberty. And this article is well known and well respected by academic philosophers, but it's always about 10,000 times less well known about the general public than the original Nozick is. So in the paper, Cohen addresses the Chamberlain argument point by point. Take, for example, the crucial principle that Nozick is appealing to in the Chamberlain story. Right? Whatever arises from a just situation as a result of fully voluntary transactions on the part of all legitimately concerned persons is itself just. Without this crucial assumption, Nozick can't trap the advocates of D1 into therefore having to accept D2. And as Cohen says, Nozick is so utterly convinced of this principle that he assumes that it, quote, must be accepted by people attached to a doctrine of justice, which in other respects differ from his own. But, why should we all accept this principle? Let's really slow down and think about this a little bit more carefully. One of the first things Cohen points out is that standard ways of testing whether we should accept some general moral principle like this would involve looking for possible scenarios that conform to the principle, but even so seem obviously unjust. If we can find cases like that, counterexamples like that, then we have a pretty good reason to doubt the principle. And it's very easy to find counterexamples to Nozick's principle that whatever arises from a just situation as a result of fully voluntary transactions must therefore be just. Cohen says that the strongest counterexample would be slavery. If voluntary self-enslavement is possible, then we have a pretty good reason to doubt Nozick's principle. If we're pretty sure slavery is unjust, right? Even if it originates in people voluntarily selling themselves into it. And, I am indeed pretty sure that slavery is unjust. That feels a whole lot more obvious to me than any principle as abstract as the one Nozick is appealing to here could be, right? Like if somebody says, hey, do you agree that any distribution that starts from a just distribution and proceeds from there by steps which, don't violate anyone's rights must therefore be just? I might nod along to it. I might say, I guess that sounds plausible, right? But I mean, if somebody says, hey, do you think slavery is always wrong? That would be a much more emphatic, yeah, that's definitely true, right? Now, Nozick is a smart guy. He anticipates this exact objection, and he bites the bullet. He says that while, of course, hereditary slavery is wrong, people have a right in the, presumably very rare cases where someone would voluntarily, freely make this choice. People have a right to enter into even a contract that makes them someone else's slave for life. Now, maybe you might find yourself half sympathizing with this insane idea if you're just like a super duper libertarian about non-economic issues. Like, this isn't my position, right? But maybe you, the viewer or listener, are someone who's like totally opposed to motorcycle helmet laws, seatbelt laws, and you think people should have a right to buy heroin if they want it, and I don't know, we should make assisted suicide available even to people who are like upset about breakups. Personally, I don't agree with any of that. I think personal freedom is important, but I think there's a limit. I'm not an absolutist about it. I think it does sometimes need to be weighed against other important values. But even if that's where you're at on heroin laws and seatbelt laws and all of that, I still think you should question what Nozick is saying about the voluntary slavery case. Right? Especially when you hook it up with his acceptance of extreme disparities of wealth, so long as they come about the right way. Because in a severely economically unequal society, I don't think voluntary slavery contracts would be especially voluntary, just like historically. Indentured servitude contracts were not especially voluntary. Think about situations where like your kids might be on the brink of starving to death. You can't find, money to buy food to feed them. So to save them, you sell yourself into slavery. And things get even grimmer when we remember that a big part of the role that Nozick leaves for his night watchman state is enforcing contracts and protecting property holders against theft. When we put all this together, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that in Nozick's libertarian utopia, not only would economically desperate people have the option of literally selling themselves as a last resort, but when they later had second thoughts, it sounds to me like the night watchman state would have to be in the business of catching runaway slaves. At this point, if it were me, I would be tempted to say that Nozick has refuted himself by biting a bullet this massive, and no further outside refutation is necessary. But Cohen doesn't take this route. Right? The point about slavery is just the opening move in his paper. He goes on to examine, for example, the claim that because the transfers to Chamberlain were voluntary and the people who opted out still have their shares, that therefore no one has any grounds to object. So here's what he says. Where are we? He says, in defending the justice of the Chamberlain transaction, Nozick glances at the position of persons not directly party to it. Right? So Nozick says, after someone transfers something to Wilt Chamberlain, third parties still have their legitimate shares. Their shares are not changed. This is false in one relevant sense. For a person's effective share depends on what he can do with what he has. And that depends not only on how much he has, but on what others have, and how what others have is distributed. If it is distributed equally among them, he will often be better placed than if some have especially large shares. So again, it's just not true that the people who chose not to give their money to Chamberlain aren't affected by the transaction. And even beyond this, there's the question of how all the third parties who haven't been born yet are affected by the transaction. Nozick leaves their interests out of the Chamberlain parable altogether. They too have an interest in growing up in a more just and equal society. Nozick dismisses any concern about the wealth of others as envy, but what Cohen emphasizes over and over again in this paper is that inequalities in wealth beyond a certain point can't be meaningfully separated from inequalities in power. So let's unpack that last point a little. The most obvious way that this might be true is just that, in every nominally democratic society that's ever existed, extreme material inequality has found some way to translate itself into unequal influence on the political process. I think if, regardless of your ideology, if you don't acknowledge that much, you're just working very hard not to acknowledge it. What Cohen emphasizes, though, is not unequal power in this like secondary political sense, but the unequal economic power, the heart of the capitalist mode of production. Most of the working age population under capitalism has no realistic choice except to sell their working hours to capitalists. They then spend half their waking hours most days of the week following orders from an unelected boss and producing wealth over whose eventual distribution they have very little say. All right, so Cohen writes, one difference between a capitalist state and a slave state is that the natural right not to be subordinate in the matter of a slave is a civil right in liberal capitalism. The law excludes the formation of a set of persons legally obliged to work for others. That status being forbidden, everyone is entitled to work for no one. But the power corresponding to this right is differentially enjoyed. Right? Some can live without subordinating themselves, but most cannot. Right? As Marx puts it in Wage, Labor, and Capital, right? The worker, doesn't have to work for any particular master, but he does have to find one and work for him. And I think one of the most perceptive things that Cohen points out along the way here is that Wilt Chamberlain is a strategically well-chosen example for Nozick when you remember that we're all looking at that case with the habits of mind that we got from growing up in what's already a very inegalitarian society. We're accustomed to the premise, right, that some people will become rich and others won't. I mean, that just sort of goes without saying in the society we live in. And given that we just take that much for granted, I mean, that's just the water, right? Then of all the people who can get one of those lifelines that let them, ascend up the class structure, we have maybe less reason to begrudge that to a basketball player than we do like 90% of the other people who become rich. As Cohen puts it, if we're going to have a society in which there's a category of like rich and powerful people, then who better and more innocently could join those people's ranks? But the deeper question is whether we want society to be divided between a working class majority and a minority with wealth that can be translated into economic power over the rest of us. If most of us are forced to subordinate ourselves to capitalists, we're that much less free. Maintaining at least a relatively egalitarian pattern of distribution, whether we do that by like phasing money and production for exchange entirely out of some, extremely advanced stage of the socialist future, or by just taxing the Chamberlains of the world, right, redistributing their wealth until the inequality between them and the rest of us isn't enough for them to start building up intergenerational fortunes or privately buying up the means of production. Either way, stopping that inequality from rising keeps the rest of us more free because we're not forced by our economic circumstances to subordinate ourselves to others. That's why Cohen's paper is subtitled How Patterns Preserve Liberty. Now, I think that the rights-based argument against the redistribution of wealth is really unconvincing. But put that aside for a moment, right? Cohen's point here would be that even if we accept for the sake of argument that redistribution infringes to some extent on the liberty of those having their wealth redistributed away, and Cohen actually doesn't think it does, but remember, we're just assuming this for the sake of argument, then redistribution would still be justified precisely in order to prevent a far greater infringements on the liberty of the majority of the population. Even on that assumption, achieving and maintaining a more equal society, Cohen thinks, would be a big net increase in human freedom. By the way, Cohen points out in passing, but this is one of my favorite lines in the whole essay. If you really think it obvious that Wilt Chamberlain wouldn't continue to play basketball if he weren't allowed to build up great wealth by doing so, you've merely shown that you misunderstand human nature or basketball or both. I think he's right about that. Anyway, Nozick objects to the net increase in liberty sort of defense of redistribution on two grounds. First, even in an extreme situation where someone is literally left with the options to either work for a capitalist or starve, and by the way, I mean, I'll just point out that that's an extreme situation that's only become rare because of the existence of the victories of the labor movement and the growth of a welfare state that in 1970s Robert Nozick wanted to abolish. But whatever, even in that extreme situation, Nozick denies that workers have therefore been forced to work for a capitalist. And that's because Nozick defines coercion in such a way that someone is only being coerced if their moral rights are violated. As Cohen points out elsewhere, this is a pretty absurd way of using the word coercion. 20,000, man, I was really underestimated earlier. All right. 20,000 women is how many Wilt Chamberlain said he slept with. That is just whatever else you want to say about that, you got to admire the man's work ethic in getting that done. But in any case, so Cohen points out in a different paper, this is a really weird way of using the word coercion. Because taken seriously, Nozick's idea that nothing can count as coercion unless it violates the rights of the person being coerced would mean that, quote, if a criminal's imprisonment is morally justified, he is therefore not forced to be in prison. That seems pretty odd. Okay, so Nozick's second objection is that liberty is such an absolute value that Nozick thinks it's just not acceptable to intentionally engage in even slight violations of the rights of some, even in order to protect against far greater violations of the liberty of others. Right? That it's it's all that in Nozick's mind, right? It's all like the same kind of way we might object to like pushing some people on trolley tracks to save the lives of others, right? He thinks we're doing something wrong in that same sort of way, right? So Nozick thinks that the unacceptability of even slightly infringing on the liberty of anybody, even to prevent sort of big net losses in the liberty of the working class majority, he thinks this has something to do with the separateness of persons. We can't sacrifice the good of some for the greater good of society because there is no such entity as society, right? Nozick says there is no social entity that undergoes a sacrifice for its own good, but there are only different individual people with their own individual lives. And Cohen simply notes in response that nothing about the trade-off in question requires us to appeal to some sort of social entity. We can simply think that forcing the working class majority, right, forcing members of that working class majority, individual members of that majority, into a lifelong position of subordination is so much worse for those individuals than the comparatively trivial violation of the liberty of capitalists if, some of the money in their bank account or their stock portfolio or their deeds to factories or whatever are taken away, that it's just not a hard choice, even if the only value we're thinking about is the value of freedom. In fact, we can take the separateness of persons really seriously, and on that very basis, realize that if we're thinking about particular individual people, right, who only have one life to live, it's so bad to force anyone to spend the one and only life they get in poverty or subordinated labor that anyone who thinks that it can be justified needs a much better argument than anything that Nozick has to offer. So in the very last line of the essay, Cohen concludes that, quote, libertarian, unquote, capitalism sacrifices liberty to capitalism, a truth its advocates are able to deny only because they're prepared to abuse the language of freedom. And I'm not sure what else there is to say beyond that this damning summation is extremely well earned, and that 50 years later, it continues to be depressingly relevant in contexts very far removed from academic philosophy. And I think that's about all I have to say about that for today. Yeah, exactly, Eric. Chamberlain will stop playing basketball for a living if he can't get rich doing so. Say dudes who keep jobs that make them miserable on Sunday evenings because it's so close to Monday. Courtney says, I got to say, watching Ben debate dead people is way more interesting than watching debate contemporary conservatives. Well, it's funny that you should mention contemporary conservatives. So again, apologies that we had to skip yesterday's show. I was on a flight when we would normally do it, but I am going to be back tomorrow. Going to be in the middle of a road trip, but find a Starbucks or a Panera or something that I can do the show from on the road to do an episode on Curtis Yarvin, who has written an essay called, and I swear I'm not making this up, "You Can't Handle the Truth." And it is exactly as amazing and unself-aware as that title makes it sound. So I figured it'd be good to close out the week with something fun, something a little less heavy than Robert Nozick, like poking into the strange morass of Mr. Yarvin's worldview. So that's going to be the same time. We're going to be sticking with this. That is 11:30 a.m. on the East Coast, which is actually where I am right at the moment, and 8:30 a.m. on the West Coast, which is where I normally am. And I will see you then. Left is best.